Chapter 4. The last time Grandpa and Dad talked to each other was when Dad announced he was moving us to Arizona. Grandpa blew his stack. Arizona? Why in hell would you want to live in that desert? That's my only grandchild you got there, Harlan. How can you take him away from his home, from his grandpa? They argued for a while, Grandpa swearing and shouting, Dad yelling right back. As usual, the only thing their arguing did was make them both madder. On the morning that we left, Grandpa refused to help us load up the car. He just stood on the front porch and watched. When it was time to leave, Dad slid behind the wheel and said, "Say goodbye to your grandpa, Hiram. No telling when you'll see him again." Mom glared at Dad a moment and then sighed and walked over to hug Grandpa. She whistled something in his ear that made him smile and pat her on the back. "Thanks, Earl," she said as she walked back to the car. "Thanks for everything, especially for taking good care of Hiram." Then it was my turn to say goodbye, and I didn't want to. "Come here, boy," Grandpa said as he opened his arms to welcome me. I ran to him and wrapped my arms around his wide body, burying my face in the bib of his blue overalls. I felt him tremble. "I'm going to miss you, son," he said with a catch in his voice. "You be a good boy in Arizona, and make sure you don't go forgetting your grandpa." "I won't, Grandpa," I struggled not to cry. "I promise." I gave him one last hug and ran back to the car. "Harlan, Dee," Grandpa called to my parents, "y'all know that boy is welcome here any time. I'd be awful glad to help keep him on summers with me, and I'd treat him right." Mom nodded and waved as Dad drove us away from the house without even looking back. Grandpa stood on the porch and waved until we turned the corner onto Cotton Street. We survived our first Arizona summer and settled into Tempe quickly. Dad started work at Arizona State College, and Mom stayed home and started having babies. It always seemed ironic to me that once we left the Delta and fertile Mississippi for the barren Arizona desert, Mom and Dad suddenly started producing kids at the rate of one per year for 4 years. Joseph was born about a year after we got to Tempe, 1949. Then came Emma, Eliza, and finally Briam in 1952. Arizona turned out to be everything Dad had hoped it would be. He seemed happier than ever, and I wasn't sure if it was because of his job at the college, our new lives in Arizona, or just being away from Mississippi. It took me a year to get over leaving Grandpa in Greenwood, and even though I eventually adjusted to living in Tempe, the annual invitation from Grandpa to spend the summer in Greenwood would get me mad all over again. When I turned into a teenager, I got older and bolder, and I'd argue with Dad about it, but he was stubborn as a stump. "This is your home now, Hiram. Your family's here and you're staying here. If Grandpa really wants to see you, he'll come out here and visit on my terms. I will not have you spending 3 months in Mississippi getting a head full of your grandpa's southern nonsense." "But he's my grandpa." "That's enough, Hiram Hilburn. You say one more word on this and you'll be mighty sorry." Dad's eyes got wide and mean looking, and his face turned red just like it used to when he argued with Grandpa. And even though I was older and bolder, I knew there'd only be trouble if I pushed him anymore. Except for the regular fights with Dad, the last few years went smooth enough. I grew a few inches, did pretty well in school, and learned how to avoid Dad. Those years, our worst battles always started over my wanting to visit Grandpa in Mississippi. The last time we fought about it, I used every excuse I could think of. Finally, I said, "He's your dad, my grandpa. It's family, even if you don't like it. You ought to want to go back as bad as I do." "I don't need you to be telling me what I should and should not do. There are some things, Hiram, you just can't understand. Maybe when you're older, you will." "But Grandpa invited me. You've got to let me go." "You listen to me. I will not have one of my children giving me orders, understand? Don't you be bothering me about this again." He glared at me with that mean look I'd seen him use with Grandpa. And I mean it. I wanted to bother Dad about it. I wanted to bother him bad. He should be the one trying to get to Greenwood. He should be the one most concerned about Grandpa. It made me furious that he didn't care at all about his own father or about what I wanted. I was almost 16 in April 1955 when Grandpa's annual invitation to Greenwood arrived, but this letter was different. He'd had a small stroke. Not a serious one, he said, but he'd need someone to help him for a while until he got his strength back. "The stroke and the diabetes Doc Peterson says I've got have slowed me down some," he wrote. "There's plenty of work that needs doing, son, and until I get feeling good again, I don't know how much I'll be able to do by myself." He'd also written to Mom, and whatever he said must have convinced her, because she took it up with Dad as soon as he got home from work. Before he even set his briefcase down by the door, she started on him. Earl is going to need some more help, Harlan. Ruth Ann's already got her hands full. You know I don't like the idea of Hiram being in Greenwood, Dad said. It's his being with your father that you don't like. Your dad is not going to poison him one bit, and you know it. Hiram's nearly 16, and you know better than anyone that he's got his own mind. It'll be good for him to spend some time with his grandfather, and it will do wonders for Earl. I don't like it, Dee. Not one bit. How can you not like it? He's your father, Hiram's grandfather, and we owe it to him. If he hadn't been willing to tend Hiram all those years we were in Oxford, I don't know what we would have done. You wouldn't have finished Old Miss, that's for sure. Besides, maybe doing service for someone else all summer will be good for Hiram. Dad said nothing. Mom had him backed into a corner. Harlan, let the boy go. Help your father. Maybe it'll soften his heart. Maybe it'll soften yours, too. Dad sighed. All right, but not until school's out, not for the entire summer, and he's got to be back before school starts again. I couldn't believe Mom had won. I couldn't believe Dad had given in. I smiled, not because Dad had lost, but because I was actually going to Greenwood. Dad noticed my grin, and when Mom left the room, he said, You think you won something big, don't you? Well, you're going to find out that I know some things you don't. Greenwood's not going to be what you expect, Hiram. You're older now, you'll see. And I'm sorry for what you'll see. I had no idea what he was talking about, and I didn't care. All I knew was that finally I was going back to Greenwood, and to Grandpa. Dad stalled my trip as long as he could. When school was out in June, he said we couldn't afford the train fare to Mississippi. It wasn't until the middle of July that he announced that we had enough money for me to go. He'd already booked a ticket on the Santa Fe rail line and told me I'd be leaving August 19th. When the 19th arrived, Mom took me to the train station in Phoenix. It was no surprise that Dad wasn't there. He said he had some meetings on campus, but I was sure that he just didn't care enough about me to come. That didn't bother me, because I felt the same way about him. I was looking forward to seeing Grandpa again, but more than anything, I was glad to be away from Dad for a while. Your grandfather said Ruth Ann will meet you at the station in Greenwood, said Mom. Behave yourself on the train, and be sure to pay attention to the stops. I know you'll be good to Grandpa, Hiram, but you make sure you look after him the best you can, and mind him and Ruth Ann while you're in that house. Then she quickly hugged me. The train steam whistle sounded, and the porters called all aboard. I love you, son, she said as I stepped up into the passenger car. Have a wonderful time with Grandpa. After I stowed my bags and found my seat, I felt excited and sad at the same time. I would miss Mom and the kids, but I couldn't wait to get back home to Grandpa and Mississippi.